to A Square Pillow Isn't Square, the channel where you will learn anything and everything you ever wanted to know about home deck sewing. I am in the middle of making a series on how to make the perfect pillow, and today I was actually going to make a video about how to apply welt cord, welt trim in the seam of a pillow, and the easiest way to join the welt. But as I was thinking about how I was going to do that, it occurred to me that a lot of people don't really understand welt very well. What's the difference between welt and piping? How do you know how wide to cut the strips of fabric to cover your welt cord? Why, when you go to the home deck fabric store to buy fabric for your pillow, they try and sell you so much fabric to make little strips of fabric. So I decided I would do a video, Welt 101, just so you have a good foundation and understanding of welt cord, and that'll help you understand how much fabric to buy for your project and how to use it the most efficiently and economically. Here we have a variety of cords. They range from 1 inch in diameter to 5/64 of an inch in diameter. The only real difference between piping cord and welt cord is the diameter of it. The two little cords you see on the far right are normally used in piping, and what makes it piping instead of welt? It's really just in what application it's used. Piping is a term used for cording that is used in clothing and garment construction. The other 6 cords that you see range from not even 1/4 of an inch all the way up to 1 inch, and those are normally used in home deck sewing, in upholstery, cushions, things like that. For whatever reason, in that application, it is referred to as welt cord. The bias is simply a 45-degree angle across the width or length of the fabric. And here we have a piece of fabric folded at 45 degrees, and this folded line that you see is folded on the bias of the fabric. The reason that it's so important to make welt out of the bias is because it behaves differently than fabric that's cut on the lengthwise or crosswise grain. And let me show you an example. So let's start with cutting a strip of fabric in the way that uses the least amount of material. This is just a 2-inch strip of fabric that is cut off the length of our fabric. So here I have the piece of fabric, little 2-inch piece of fabric that I cut off of my fabric that I have on my table. As you can see very clearly, a very small amount of fabric. And if I were to fold it over, the way I would wrap it around my welt cord, you can see that the direction of it is one thing to consider. When you put it across the top of your pillow, it will run vertically, and then as it turns the corner and runs down the side, it'll be running horizontally. And you also have to think about how that pattern is going to line up on the pattern that you've cut out of your fabric for your pillow. You're going to have to worry about matching these stripes, or they're going to be a little wacky. So those are one thing to consider, is the direction your fabric runs in the welt. But the most important thing to consider is that fabric that is cut on the crosswise or lengthwise grain doesn't have any give. And let me show you an example of that. If I take this fabric and grab it real tight and try and pull it, stretch it, nothing's happening. Fabric on the crosswise and especially on the lengthwise grain is what they call stable. It's very stable. It's the least stretchy direction of the fabric. Now if you imagine, if I fold this down like I'm going on my cording and I try and turn a corner, it's not bending very well at all. There's puckers and it just isn't very fluid. I just took that piece of fabric and I sewed some welt cord inside of it to make a piece of welt to show you exactly what I was talking about, how if you try and turn corners with fabric that is cut on the straight or lengthwise grain of the fabric, it is stiff and puckery, and it just simply does not make a nice looking curve. Let's compare that to a piece of fabric cut on the bias. Okay, so here we have our piece of fabric cut on the bias, a true 45-degree angle. The first thing you're going to see is that because the direction of it is on the diagonal, there's no way it's going to match the pattern on the pillow, so you don't have to worry about that. It's going to provide a nice contrast. More importantly, watch this. I'm going to take my fabric and I'm going to pull. Did you see that? Did you see how much give and stretch that fabric has? That is why we want to make welt cord, especially welt cord that we're turning corners on the bias, because what will happen now, when I fold that over my cording and I go and wrap my corner, it's going to bend really nicely. And now you see I have sewn some welt cord into the bias strip of fabric, and it is curving beautifully. Not a pucker, not a stiff spot anywhere that you can see. It just is fluid, bendable, and perfect for going around curves. If you've got a lot of just really straight lines and your welt cord is being applied in straight lines, it's not as important or even necessary to cut it on the bias. But in drapery and bedding, when you're talking about pillows, you're talking about maybe in the bottom of a valance that has maybe a curve shape to it, or a scallop shape to it, or a taper to the outside ends. Anytime you want a little flexibility, fluidity, and movement, then you're going to want to cut your welt strips on the bias. So now we're going to figure out how wide our strips of fabric need to be to cover our welt cord. Here I have a piece of cotton welt cord. All you have to do is take your soft tape, put it underneath, and gently wrap it around. You don't want to wrap it real tight. You have to remember that fabric has some thickness, and so you got to allow for the take up that just the thickness of the fabric can create. But if you see this little dark line here, this is my 1/2 inch mark. You want to make sure you have at least a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both sides. And as you can see, this takes me right about to my 2 inch mark. So 2 inches is the correct width of my fabric strips for covering this welt. 2 inches is the width of the strips I used earlier in the demonstration, so let me show you how nicely that works. I'll lay my cord into the fabric. I will fold it over, and when it's sewn, look at that, I have a nice 1/2 inch seam allowance, plenty of fabric for what I need to do. That's how you determine the width of your fabric for your welt cord. So let's start with figuring out how many strips you need. If you determined you don't need bias cut fabric, you can just cut your fabric strips right off the length of the fabric. If you determine that 2 inches is the right width for your fabric strips, all you have to do is determine how much welt you need. Let's say in this case you need 80 inches. Then you divide it by how wide your fabric is. In this case, my fabric's about 60 inches wide. 80 inches divided by 60 inches is 1.3 strips. One isn't enough, so I will cut 2 strips of fabric. In this situation, 2 strips of fabric at 2 inches wide, I only need 4 inches of fabric to get my welt. But if you have determined that you want bias strips to cover your welt, this is where it can get a little bit trickier. I mean, right now you see that I've folded this fabric at a true bias across the full width of the fabric, and that gave me strips of fabric that are almost 80 inches long. But at the same time, it took about 60 inches of fabric to do it. If you've decided you just don't need strips that long, or you don't want to commit that much fabric to your bias strips, you can use less fabric. So here I have a piece of fabric that is only I've only allowed about a yard of fabric to make my bias strips. And that gives me bias strips that are about 50 inches long. So notice something else here. Even though it seems kind of wasteful to use a yard or a yard and a half of fabric to make a bias strip, often you can use what I call the fall off, the piece that's cut off, the leftover piece from that strip, to actually make your front and back of your pillow cover. So even though you're cutting that fabric in the diagonal, the piece that's left over can be really useful for pillow fronts and backs or for other things in your project. So as you can see, the amount of fabric you fold over to make your 45-degree angle affects the length that your strips are going to be. The less that you fold over, the shorter the strips are going to be, which means you'll need more of them to do your project, and there will be more seams in your project. The more fabric that you fold over, the longer your strips are going to be, which means less seams and less cut strips that you'll need for your project. Now just cut along that fold line, take away the piece of leftover fabric that is folded over the top, and you are ready to mark and cut your fabric strips. And in the next video, we are going to learn how to sew our strips together, how to make the covered welt cord, how to apply it to our pillow, and the fastest and easiest way to join the welt. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching. If you like what you see, please subscribe, and we'll see you next time.